everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I am going to be doing a review of A City Dreaming by Daniel Polansky. This is my second Daniel Polansky book and this guy is shaping up to be a new favourite author. I just love his writing style. I love everything about the way that he writes characters. He's such an interesting author in the sense that I feel like his writing style is quite unique. Let me read the back of the blurb of this book. And normally I do summaries myself, but the blurb I think would do a better job of explaining what is going on than me. Here we go. M is a drifter with a sharp tongue, few scruples and limited magical ability, who would prefer drinking artisanal beer to involving himself in the politics of the city. Alas, in the infinite nexus of the universe, that is New York City, trouble is a hard thing to avoid, and now a rivalry between the city's two queens threatens to make the Big Apple go the way of Atlantis. To stop it, M will have to call in every favour, waste every charm and blow every spell he's ever required. He might even have to get out of bed before noon. Enter a world of Wall Street wolves, slumming scenesters, desperate artists, drug-induced divinities, pocket steampunk universes and hipster zombies, because the city never sleeps but is always dreaming. Now, I love books that are set in New York because I'm a big fan of New York City. I was planning to move there, COVID hit, I was planning to move there again, then I quit my job. I think eventually I will end up there at some point. But New York is my favourite, so I love reading New York in my books. I love seeing it in movies. It feels very nostalgic. It reminds me of all the amazing times that I've had there. So when I saw that Polansky wrote this book and that it was a standalone and it was set in New York, I was like, okay, this is the next one that I have to pick up after I've read The Builders. And this book is wild. There were so many things that I loved about this book. The first thing that I will talk about is what I mentioned earlier on, is his writing. His writing is so rich, it's so accessible. It is very colloquial, but I mean that in a really positive way because it feels like I'm in this main character's head and I really feel like his thoughts are my thoughts. And even though this is a third person narrative, I feel like we have a really deep connection to the main character because the story is told through his eyes. And I loved it. I loved it. Polansky has a really unique way of writing. It kind of reminds me of Abercrombie. I feel like it's a little bit more informal than Abercrombie, but it's so worked with the types of characters that he has. And that has to bring me on to the next bit. I love Polansky's characters. I just think he's a wonderful character writer. M is the main character that we follow, and I loved being in his head. He's just this kind of very blasé, lives life each day at a time. You know, he doesn't really plan. He doesn't really think about the future. He's just like, this is life. I'm just going to enjoy each day. I'm going to take it how it comes and, you know, figure it out as I go along, basically. I love that kind of loosey-goosey, figure it out as it goes along kind of attitude. Like, it's an attitude that I'm trying to adopt a little bit more of. I think there's negatives to being an overly planning person, but there's also negatives to being overly chilled as well. There's balance, right? Like all good things. And I think M is definitely an extreme. And I really liked being in his head because it's so different, I would say, to how I typically am, even though I am trying to become a bit more chilled in that regard, which I definitely think I am. So I felt like M was quite relatable because even though he was an extreme, I could definitely see certain things in certain situations where he was reacting where I was like, yeah, I could totally see myself reacting like that now. And I loved it. He just felt so, like, he feels like someone that you could know and he feels like someone that you could even be. And I love that in my characters. I love it when they feel like there's someone who is in your life, or, you know, you even have similar characteristics. There is also a really wonderful secondary cast. They're not, I would say, as fleshed out as M, but we do have some really funny characters that just make me laugh. I mean, there's one character, I've forgotten his name. I think it's like Harrison or something. He's British and he talks like a proper British London lad. It's just really funny. I just really enjoyed like having that character type in the story because it enriches the world and it really shows the uniqueness that I think New York has more so than any other city, where, you know, you have such eclectic people there. I mean, you have that to some degree in London too, but I feel like it's heightened in New York. You have really unique, eclectic individuals, and that is basically what the surrounding character cast is. They're just a bunch of really unique, eclectic characters who are all mashed together and they all have to like figure out things as they go along. And I love that. I'm here for it. I'm totally here for it. Next thing that I really like, that I know a lot of people are not going to like, is that there isn't really a story. There is really no plot. I thought the plot would start to pick up. I was about a third of the way and I was like, okay, I'm assuming the plot's going to start soon. There isn't really one. I mean, there is one in the sense that, you know, we have this kind of deeper political strife that is very much present in this world, but there is no real plot. There is no real sense of, oh, this is the mission that we have to do and we have to solve that mission, blah, blah, blah. There are parts like that, but I don't think it's the central part of the story. I think the central part of the story is really about this character. And I really think New York is such a big part of the story too. It's almost a character in itself. That's what this book feels like. It feels like a love letter to New York. And I feel like, I don't know what Daniel Polansky is like himself, but maybe M is a version of him and he sees himself in him. I could totally see that, because I definitely did that for me. The story itself is more about New York and how different parts of New York react to the events that are happening, if that makes sense. That's not very eloquently worded. There is no real core part of the story, and I think a lot of people are going to hate that. I loved it because I love the characters, I love New York, I just love the way that it felt so nostalgic for me. It just felt so visceral. Like there were parts that I read and I felt like I was in New York, I was in Manhattan, I was in Brooklyn, like, and it's making me want to go to New York right now, but unfortunately I can't because I've got other things that I have to do. So there's that. The next thing that I really loved was the fact that this book is quite deep in places. I wouldn't say it's the most philosophical book, but I think there's some really interesting character work that really explores kind of friendship and loyalty. These are both things that I love reading about in my books, and we obviously get a lot of that from M and his relationship with his friends and his comrades and his employers. And it's just really, like, it's really unique because I've never read a story that's character centric in this way. Like, it's a very specific way of doing a character driven book. It's very different to Abercrombie, it's very different to Baker, it's very different to all of the other character driven authors that I love, like KJ Parker and Daniel Abraham. It's just very unique. Like, I feel like you can group a lot of fantasy authors. I feel like Daniel Polansky, for me at least right now, is kind of in his own bucket, and I kind of love that. The last thing that I'm going to mention is that I really love the dialogue in this book. The dialogue is so witty. I mean, ultimately that comes from the way that the characters are written, but there were times where I laughed out loud. There were parts where I smiled. There were parts where I was like, yeah, I would totally say something like that. As I said earlier, it really brings it back to that relatability aspect of the story. Honestly, this book just really felt like this could be my life if I was as extreme as M. And if I had magic, which I don't, unfortunately. I can't rave about it enough, but I will say this book is not going to be for everybody. I think a lot of people are not going to enjoy this book as much as I did, because the characters are very morally grey naturally. The fact that there isn't really any plot, and the fact that the story kind of meanders a little bit here and there, a lot of people are really not going to enjoy that. But for me, sign me up. It's what I love about these types of books. Daniel Polansky is definitely becoming a favourite author of mine. I'm going to plan to read his trilogy, Lowtown trilogy, this year. I have the first book, so I'm really excited to read that because I'm really curious to see how his writing differs when he writes a trilogy versus a standalone, because that's all I've been reading so far. So without further ado, I'm going to read a few quotes just to give you a sense of his writing. But for a while, it was enough to slip through the city like vapor, to remember and discover, to remember and to rediscover, to take pleasure in the surfeit of human possibility, which is New York's defining quality. I really, you know, when I was reading this book, I really wanted to go to New York. Okay, next one. Stockdale is the name of the British guy, not Harrison. Don't know how I managed to confuse those two names. Stockdale and M had been friends for longer than he could remember. This was a literal fact, not an exaggerated piece of sentimentality. He was a decent enough chap, apart from being ramrod straight, rather bigoted, long-winded, overly enamoured of his own person, and above all, utterly, determinedly, deliberately British. He dressed like a country squire and carried himself like the hero of a Kipling story, an affectation made all the more curious by his being an ethnic Pakistani and thus on the wrong side of the white man's burden. It's so good. I laughed out loud when I read that the first time. Okay, next one. I'll do a few more. I would think you'd have about wandered yourself out of the places to wander, long as you've been doing it, which was the sort of thing that people who stayed in one place often think, though any traveller knows that seeing the world is a full-time job. Because you can't see everything, and even if you could, by the time you got to the last place, the first place would have changed so much that you couldn't really say you'd seen it anymore. And also, what else is there to do? All right, we'll do one more. I love this paragraph. But what was money anyway in the city in spring? And of course, New York is the city. It has enjoyed that distinction at least since the collapse of the British Empire, Stockdale be damned. It is not the prettiest city in the world. It is not the safest. It is not the cleanest. It is miserable in the winter and for large portions of the summer. Many people, visitors and short-term residents alike, find it absurdly expensive, stultifyingly pretentious, not worth the time or the trouble or the expense. And they aren't entirely wrong, but their opinion does not carry with it any weight of importance. Like the sun, like the Old Testament, like a beautiful woman, New York does not care what you think of it. History has rendered its judgment, and it is left to only us to uphold it. Couldn't agree more. And that's it. That's my review of A City Dreaming by Daniel Polansky. I loved everything about this book. Be very kind of wary about reading this book if you're not particularly a character-driven reader, but I can't wait to read more Polansky in the coming, If you've read it, let me know. I've not met anybody who's read this book, so do let me know because I'd love to chat to you about it. And otherwise, I will see you in the next video. Stay safe, everybody. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.